stream on Facebook. Okay, Hare Krishna, everybody. Welcome. So I'm going to start with Mangala Charan prayers as always, and then we'll get into today's topic. So, Om Mangyana Timirandasya Yananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militum Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Siddhanto Palasara Nityarasikang Hang Sang Vilasatmakang Audaryakya Siddhama Sevakadanam Vishramba Bhakti Pradam Yakya Yukti Vichakshanam Bhagavato Vashishta Shakya Sada Vandehang Tripurari Namakayating Shri Bhakti Vedantinam Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyeva cha patitanam bhavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha Ajano lambita bhujao kanakavatatao sankirtanaika pataro kamalaya taksho vishwambaro dvijavarao yukadharma palo vande jagapriya karo karunavataro vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sahodito Godadaye Pushpavanto Chitro Shando Tamonada Vandehang Shri Ramakrishna Abhaya Charana Sukhao Sukadao Paramanando Sundaro Subalo Priyo Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vandana Koriti Mui Kata Shakti Dhari Tamo Buddhi Doshe Mui Damba Matra Kori Tatapi Mukera Bhagya Manera Ulas Dosha Kshami Modame Korani Jadas. So Hare Krishna. So I'll get right into the topics for today. Well, I'll give a little summary of last time for those who might who might be tuning in for the first time. But we've been discussing refining our desires in the school of Uttama Bhakti that we find ourselves in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's school, right? So last time we looked at qualification, and we were discussing how really, to the degree that our motivation of our practice is for prema, or the attainment of selfless loving service to Krishna, you could say that's the degree to which we're qualified as students of Uttama Bhakti. So that might not mean that we're free of material desires, but we aren't practicing our bhakti to fulfill them. So we saw the contrast of Rupa Goswami he gave with different kinds of devotees who were approaching the Lord, but yet they had some ulterior motive in the form of material acquisition or liberation, such as Dhruva Maharaj, Gajendra, Shaunaka and the sages, and the four Kumaras. And of course, as they were approaching Krishna, they're also glorious souls themselves. Not that we should think of them disparagingly, as is the case with any devotee, any kind of devotee, even those outside our own school or tradition who might have different spiritual ideals. However, Krishna being who he is, all attractive, he charmed all those kinds of devotees enough that their motivations changed. So the point being that any contact with bhakti is extremely powerful, but it does require a refining of our motivations and attitudes to enter the spirit of the 1.111 verse we've been discussing that defines Uttama Bhakti, this famous Anyabhilashita Shunyam verse. So we also may have initially come with mixed motivations ourselves. You know, the four types of motivations Krishna gives as to in the Gita as to why devotees approach him. But as we hear more and practice more, these motivations become more and more refined, and they'll continue to become more and more refined. But wherever we are, even if at times we're haunted by our material conditioning, if the goal of our practice is Krishna prema, then we're considered in the school of Uttama Bhakti, and the category of Kanishta Adhikari. This has been graciously created for those of us who still have some heart cleansing to do, so that we aren't distracted from, let's say, steady focused practice or nishta, which is our interim goal. So hearing the spiritual ideals, this can shine a light into where we are, as well as providing motivation for deepening our own practice or commitment to the path. So we also spent, in that context, we also spent a little time on this concept of yukta vairagya, or dovetailing, to explore how we can refine our desire to go back to Godhead, or from liberation from material suffering in general. So one way is developing a more refined understanding of what Godhead is, in that it's not a place for freedom from our own material problems, although that might be a side effect. Of course, it is a side effect, but rather we understand that it's a place where only selfless service to Krishna takes place. So the best kind of company and a state of consciousness that's worth aspiring for. To get there, though, we can also dovetail what might be there in the form of a desire for liberation by praying to be liberated from the obstacles we face in our own spiritual practice. So we see great examples of this kind of prayer in the songs of our Vaishnavacharyas. A personal favorite is Prema Bhakti Chandrika by Srila Narottam Das Thakur, for example. But there are many songs, many bhajans. And so we can pray for the kind of steadiness one finds in the stage of Nishta, which is our interim goal or sub-goal in the context of pursuing prema. So we're desiring to be liberated from our obstacles, and we know the way to do so is through the power of bhakti. The bhakti is more powerful than all these things, even all the obstacles we face. So today, I'd like to continue exploring this desire to be liberated from our obstacles, but from another perspective. So as we discussed previously, all are qualified for bhakti if they have some faith in bhakti, and they aren't practicing, or we aren't practicing with a desire for material enjoyment or liberation. It's not that we have to do something before to become qualified, like another yogic process or another kind of process to gain qualification. But because we've been touched by the ideal, by the grace of sadhus, this is our qualification. So in verse, moving on in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, in verse 1 to 61, Rupa Goswami quotes from the Padma Purana, where it says, "All are qualified for Hari Bhakti, O King." So if we've been touched in the way that most, if not all of us, have by Lord Chaitanya's school, then what is it that we need to be doing? If all are qualified, we've been touched, what is it we need to be doing, even if we may have some material conditioning? So in verses 1 to 63 to 64, the verse says, "And it is said, the person qualified for bhakti is at fault if he fails to perform all the important angas of bhakti, or limbs of bhakti. But he is not at fault for failing to perform the duties of varna and ashram. If he, by chance, happens to perform some sin, there is no atonement prescribed for him. This is the opinion of those who know the secret of the Vaishnava scriptures." So a few things to say on this verse. First is that if we've been touched by bhakti, our real duty is performing the angas of bhakti, or the limbs of bhakti, the practices of bhakti. It's not that we need something more. Of course, we might have other responsibilities in the world, and other things may assist us also, but we should know and deepen our faith in the power of direct bhakti practices themselves, like Shravanam, Kirtanam, and so on, and especially when performed with as pure an intention as we can muster from where we are. So we'll get more into the limbs of bhakti, or the practices of bhakti, in the next session of this series. But in the context of refining our desire, or motivations, I want to explore this point, that even if by chance one performs sin, there is no atonement for him. So in his commentary to this verse, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he goes on to explain, if they commit forbidden acts because of influence of previous Vaishnav aparad, atonement is not required, since these pure devotees do not have a natural tendency for sinful actions. Bhakti alone acts as atonement. This is the conclusion of the Vaishnav scriptures. So this is something I think worth exploring in terms of refining our desire, because I think sometimes with statements like this and similar ones, there can be extremes in our approach to bhakti that may slow our progress more than necessary. So on the one side, sometimes due to being overwhelmed by our material conditioning, not yet being at the stage of nishta, we may fail to live up to the ideals of bhakti. And it can easily be cause a disheartened attitude toward the practice. We might feel hypocritical, why practice, these kind of things. So there can be a covering in the form of forgetting how powerful bhakti is and how it's far stronger than any of our material conditioning. And this is why it's important to know the map. As our Guru Maharaj sometimes says, it's important to know the map, to know what is going on in the background. For example, like we explored last week, the karmas are gradually burnt up the more we make progress. The acts of bhakti themselves are burning up the innumerable seeds of karma that we have in our karmic bank. So we'll explore that idea more shortly. But even if one has found themselves distracted from bhakti by their material conditioning, the point being made here is the solution is to pick oneself back up and take shelter of bhakti, not of anything else. So again, as a side note, other things may assist us. For example, if one has a serious addiction, let's say, professional help may be required. It's not just a case of just chant, Prabhu, just chant and it all will be okay. But it's in the context of Uttama Bhakti, that is, it's with this understanding that we might take assistance from other things to become more balanced, let's say, so we can become more steady in the practices of bhakti. That's still our goal, so to speak. Not so to speak, it is our goal. So on the other side, and another reason that refining is important is sometimes it's easy to take these kind of statements as a license to justify when we waver from the path, as if it's not any sort of problem to gradually be worked on and not working to overcome the hindrances. Sometimes we may try to justify the attachments, even using scripture, like we saw Arjuna doing at the start of the Gita, rather than just humbly recognizing where we are on the map. Maybe we are at a place where we're not ready to give up certain attachments and these kind of things. That's where we are on the map. But it can be a hindrance to try to justify those things or even change the philosophy rather than just humbly accepting this is where I am and I know how I must act at this stage on the map. So this is the kind of mentality we also need to refine, these two extremes. So in the spirit of encouragement, we should know that there's never any loss in attempting to traverse this path of Uttama Bhakti, no matter how strong our material conditioning may be. So in verse 1266, Rupa Goswami, he quotes from the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam with verse 1517 from the Srimad Bhagavatam. If someone gives up his occupational duties and works in Krishna consciousness and then falls down on account of not completing his work, what loss is there on his part? Moreover, what can one gain if he performs his occupational duties perfectly but does not worship the Lord? And Jiva Goswami, Srila Jiva Goswami, he says in his commentary, what misfortune can there be for a person who has begun bhakti, even if he was born in a low family? There is no loss at all if he does not complete bhakti, because the impressions of bhakti continue unbroken in future lives. So don't become despondent if material conditioning overwhelms you. Even if you feel like a hypocrite, what better thing to do than to take shelter of the holy name and practices of bhakti with confidence that these things will also fall away in the due course of time. Because if even mixed devotees, remember we spoke about mixed devotees last week, if even mixed devotees gained so much by bhakti with a completely different motivation to their practice, they had a completely different motivation than prema, that wasn't their goal. So how much more powerful must the bhakti be that's done with a motivation of being steady in the culture of Uttama Bhakti? We know that in time, by practicing bhakti, it will burn up all those influences that are hindering our advancement. So in his Madhurya Kadambini, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he explains how one who has taken up this path and is sincerely trying to come to prema, and maybe for most of us, nishta along the way, we will face all sorts of obstacles before that. And one of these is known as Vishaya Sangara, or battling attachment to the objects of the senses. So in Madhurya Kadambini, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, thereafter, Vishaya Sangara, or battling with attachment to the objects of the senses, is described. Scripture states that for a person whose heart is tainted with desire for sense enjoyment, to become absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan Sri Krishna is distant and seemingly impossible, just as an object placed in the west cannot be found by a seeker traveling east. How can he ever obtain it? Upon seeing such a statement from scripture, a devotee practicing bhakti determines all these materialistic tendencies to enjoy the objects of the senses are forcibly dragging me toward them and diminishing my attachment to performing bhajan. Therefore, I will abandon all these materialistic tendencies and vow to take complete shelter of the chanting of the holy name. Yet, even after resolving to renounce enjoying sense objects, from time to time he is cheated by them and ends up enjoying them. As it is said, Parityage Pyanishvara Jushamanas Chatan Kaman. Being incapable of relinquishing material sense pleasure, my devotee enjoys sense objects, feeling resentment and guilt. Srimad Bhagavatam 11:20, 27-28. The sadhaka at the stage of Vishaya Sangara fits this description from Shastra spoken by Bhagavan. The sadhaka battles with his material tendency to enjoy the sense objects he enjoyed previously. Sometimes he emerges victorious, and sometimes he meets with defeat at their hands. Because this stage of bhajana kriya involves a battle with the sense objects, it is appropriately called Vishaya Sangara, or war with sense pleasure. So I can imagine many of us can relate to that a lot. This verse being referred to in 11:20, 27-28, that Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur referred to, goes as follows. Is Krishna speaking? I am speaking of an aspiring devotee who has become detached from fruitive activities, for he knows them to cause sorrow. He has developed faith in the narrations of my pastimes, and he knows desires for sense enjoyment to be the emblem of misery. Although he knows this as fact, he is unable to abandon sense enjoyment. Even though such a practitioner sometimes ends up engaging in sense enjoyment, he should know in his heart of hearts that it leads to misery. He should sincerely repent for having performed such activities and understand them to be misfortunes of his own doing. At the same time, he should continue to perform bhajan of me with faith, determination, and love in order to extricate himself from this predicament. And so in his commentary, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says, in these two verses, the preliminary behavior of those qualified to practice bhakti is described. The bhakti sadhaka may know that although the sense pleasures resulting from having a spouse, children, and a family are actually sources of suffering, he is unable to renounce them. He views the objects of sense enjoyment as causes of sorrow, and with a greatly distressed heart, he makes this firm resolve in favor of his devotion. Let my attachment to my family and home die, or let it not. Let millions upon millions of obstacles come in the way of my devotional practice, or let them not. If I have to suffer in hell because of my offenses, let it be. Or let lust plague me, but I will never give up bhakti. Even if the creator, Brahma, approaches me in person and orders me to abandon my performance of bhajan to pursue monistic knowledge, jnana, or fruitive activity, karma, I will never do so. So even if we are haunted at times by our material conditioning, even if it seems like an insurmountable mountain, we want to refine our desires in this way, becoming more and more attached to our bhakti practices. This is another reason why a text like the Gita is so important to understand, the Bhagavad Gita. That very early on in the Gita, Krishna is making the point that even the pleasurable things in this world will eventually lead to sorrow because of our attachment to them and their temporary nature. So if we have this understanding, then we can be a bit philosophical, even in those times where we are pulled by the sense objects, understanding that this will never really make me happy or be as permanent as bhakti can. And so as Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out, even if it's the case, I must reap the karmic results in my next life of whatever enjoyment is being indulged in, then so be it. But still, please let me be connected to you, Krishna. Let me be connected to your devotees. Because remember, the motivation of our practice isn't or shouldn't be for liberation in the full sense. It's more for bhakti and on a deeper bhakti on a deeper and steadier level. So to avoid too much despondency in those times, it helps to understand some of the mechanics of the early stages, that bhakti is burning up our unmanifest karma first, and will continue to do so until we're free of our karma. So as we mentioned previously, that there's a discussion there in the first wave on karma that references the Padma Purana, and this point that karma is eradicated through spiritual practice, but it doesn't disappear from day one in its entirety. So as we know, everyone's familiar with this concept, that every action has a reaction. Every action has a reaction. So there's a fruit or a result for every action in this world. So a way I like to visualize it is that if we imagine a mustard seed, these little mustard seeds, for every action we perform or every desire we have, that a mustard seed forms, let's say. So we've had innumerable lifetimes that we've been collecting these mustard seeds. And we're acquiring more and more with every step in the material world. So, and taking this big old sack of mustard seeds with us from life to life. So this sack of seeds, this is the unmanifest karma, or aprarabdha karma, it's sometimes referred to. So you can imagine how big this sack is that we're carrying, if every action, every desire, and so on. And then some of those seeds will soon be ready to manifest for us to face the fruits of. So you could say, someone's taken a smaller sack and scooped up some of those mustard seeds from the ever-increasing large sack. And this smaller sack is for the very near future. So these seeds that are ready to be manifest, they're what are known as kutta. They haven't risen to the point of manifesting yet, in that they aren't part of our active lives, but they will be soon. And so as the seeds do start to sprout, they become known as bija. So we could say, to visualize, we could say that some water has been put on the seeds. So they're in the first stage of sprouting. So at that stage, functionally, they're acting like seeds, hence the name bija, whereas previously they were dormant. So in this bija stage of karma, we get a hint of them manifesting in our lives in the form of material desires for certain things, our predispositions to act in certain ways. So you can understand it's a more perceptible form of karma, but yet the karma hasn't fully manifested yet. And then when the seed fully blossoms and manifests in our life, this is the prarabdha karma, or the manifest karma. We taste the fruits of the karma, whether those fruits are sweet or they're bitter. And so even though we taste the fruits, how we react to them determines whether we create more karma or the kind of karma we create. So obviously the nuances of karma are a complex, very complex topic and beyond my brain. But when we take up spiritual practice, as we know, these seeds aren't gone in an instant, but they do start to be destroyed in reverse order. So we understand in bhakti in the early stages, we've all heard this many times, Cheto Darpanam Marjanam, that this chanting of the holy name cleanses the dust on the mirror of the heart. So this dust on the mirror of the heart are all these seeds that we've been collecting. And bhakti is so powerful that, that an untold amount of mustard seeds are being burnt up in our karmic sacks. So, going previous to the aprarabdha karma, the unmanifest karma, that ever increasing sacks, so much of that is just being burnt away and burnt away. Every little bhakti we do, even as we know, unknowing bhakti has that power also. What to speak of fixed and focused bhakti. So, further, we might even see our predispositions start to change. Whereas, let's say, we might have had a predisposition for partying in nightclubs. Now we might find ourselves more attracted to kirtan gatherings, let's say, just as an example. But obviously there's more to it than that. But if we understand what's happening, then we don't need to be too disheartened when it's time to taste some of our fruits. Because remember that through the power of bhakti, these things will go. If we do unplug ourselves or find ourselves being thrown totally off course, although naturally there should be some remorse there, we shouldn't let it paralyze us from continuing the practice where we left off. And so that brings me to the other side, I think worth pointing out and discussing a little, is although I know that the viewers here are pure-hearted in their aim, and so I'm likely, speaking to the choir, preaching to the choir, as they say, but, I tried to preach to myself also, that I've seen sometimes these verses might be taken as a reason to not strive to deepen our bhakti. Sometimes maybe developing a liberation kind of mentality, in the sense that, well, bhakti will burn up all my karma, it'll burn up all my karma. I'm guaranteed a human form next life, right? So as long as I plug in here and there, I'll be okay at the end of this life. I'll be okay. And maybe become a bit, not so determined in our bhakti, let's say. But they will be burnt up. Our karmas, but again, to the degree we engage in the practice. So if we haven't attained bhava, or at least ruchi, where material desires are retired, but I believe bhava is where full liberation is said to be, free, completely free from any tinge of material influence, then there's still a stock of seeds gradually being burnt up in the background. And we also see from the mood of the verse that Krishna says the devotee does feel some remorse. Otherwise, it can be namaparad. We've all heard these 10 offenses to the holy name, performing sinful activities on the strength of the name. So, as devotees, and devotees shouldn't get neurotic to the point of abandoning bhakti, because even like maybe a fear of, well, I'm going to be committing aparad because I've doing these things. There should be some remorse there, of course, but we should understand it's not favorable for my bhakti, and pray to come to a stage where we aren't distracted by these things, whatever they may be. So I guess what I'm saying, that we shouldn't try to justify our bad habits just because we are devotees of sorts, that we may have strong attachment and we may need to do some work to overcome them. And sometimes by our spiritual practice, Krishna may keep bringing things up again and again that we need to face. But we shouldn't try to justify using these points of Krishna, this merciful nature of his, as a reason to overindulge. Though we should refine and neglect our bhakti practices, most importantly, to neglect our bhakti practices. We should refine our mood and pray for help to overcome our obstacles. Again, not in an obsessive way, but recognizing that taking shelter of bhakti will help us more and more, especially as we develop more of a taste for higher things. So we've all been touched by bhakti in some way. So it's not that we need to practice other things and give up the practices of direct bhakti. Although we may do other things in the form of Aropa Siddha Bhakti, for example. It's something we may get into next week. But the point is, it's not just about using the philosophy and merciful nature of bhakti to not want to overcome our attachments, but should just be really honest with ourselves and Krishna about where we are and know, okay, I'm attached, or sometimes maybe I'm struggling with whatever it is I may struggle with, but I know Krishna will help me overcome these things and become steady. So knowing where we are on the map and acting as needed. It's not about justifying the things, but rather knowing where they come from and having patience while taking shelter of bhakti, refining our understanding or our mentality toward things. And then we can come to embrace this 1:11 verse more, because we'll continue to practice despite whatever may come from our previous karma. Of course, the more we do engage ourselves in bhakti, the more our obstacles will lift as more of the seeds and the seedlings are being burnt up and so on. But even if we can't do anything else, we're so overcome by our material conditioning that it seems impossible to engage in any sort of bhakti practice. There's a really nice quote that my wife really likes. She has on a little card that Ramanujacharya says, and is quoted by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in the Bhakti-loka. He says, if you cannot purify yourself by any endeavor whatsoever, then just go sit with the Vaishnavas and you will achieve all auspiciousness. And of course, we're very fortunate in that we can sit with the Vaishnavas every day in some form or other, thanks to the power of the internet and live streaming and these kind of things. So we're very fortunate, actually, that we have that opportunity. So with that, if in time, with practice, our karma will be burnt up, that the dust of the heart will be cleansed through the power of bhakti, and especially the chanting of the holy name, and sadhu sangha, of course, and especially if we're refining our desire to do so with the purest intention we can, do we have any real obstacles? And so, in one sense, no, because by the nature of sincerity, it's true we will make progress, even if we have to work some things out. But at times, due to being overwhelmed by our false identification with the mind, for example, and maybe being a bit frustrated with where we actually are on the path when we're faced with our material conditioning, it's easy, and that can be discomforting, and it's easy to ignore or repress the discomfort of where we actually are and project that onto others. And this can be dangerous. And unfortunately, I'm sure you're all aware in these times, especially, that this is rife in this age of social media, this increased fault finding and criticism of everyone else's position on the path, but our own. As we know, this can easily spiral into Vaishnava aparad, which can cause real blockages on the path in varying degrees. Now, it's one thing, we should have a good understanding of Vaishnava aparad, and that it's one thing to critique a person's philosophical understanding, backed up by Shastra, of course, with a desire to help them grow, if we have the Shastra Yukti to do so in the first place, and if we have that kind of relationship with them. But it's another thing to blast someone personally, as if we have access to their hearts. And, especially it's coming from a place of we're uncomfortable with ourselves, and it's coming from a place of wanting to feel superior or beyond the actual struggles we face ourselves in the stage of unsteady practice. And of course, this is nothing new in history, but unfortunately, it is becoming an increasing phenomenon with the rise of social media and this extra layer of distance it creates between people, an extra layer of impersonalism, you could say. So it's a shame when devotees are calling each other demons, for example, for having a different understanding, or sometimes even based on relative considerations. And it's not something healthy to feed. It's better to focus on one's own bhakti and to eliminate the demons that the majority of us have to deal with ourselves. So it also means with this type of mentality, we're unlikely to be able to really go and sit with the Vaishnavas. So we need to refine this mentality if we find it rising in ourselves. Now, as I say, so much can be said on the dangers of Vaishnava aparad. And a whole series could be focused on that for sure. And I think most devotees are aware of these things, of the mad elephant offense, as it's sometimes referred to. And we'll also discuss the limbs of bhakti next week. But one of the practices seen as a door for entering bhakti is not tolerating criticism of the Lord or his devotee. But in the context of this discussion, I want to make a few points in not letting ourselves be taken away by the mentality that can lead to it. The best defense is a good offense, as the saying goes. Our Guru Maharaj sometimes likes to quote this quote. The best defense is a good offense. So first, I want to preface by saying that, as with all things, it's not something we should become neurotic about. If we're sincerely aware of and working on our own inner demons, then it's unlikely we're going to have a tendency for Vaishnava aparad. But it can be a great obstacle for some. Now, all aparad is, of course, a great obstacle, but in time, with sincerity and recognizing them, good sadhu sangha and these kind of things, and the power of bhakti, these things will also go. But Vaishnava aparad, as Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur earlier said, the quote we read earlier, can also lead us to performing more unfavorable acts on one level, but in its most severe form, it can even uproot bhakti, or at least have very strong lingering effects, even into the stage of bhava, when it's towards the highest devotees. So it has, spiritual effects also, not just, the karmas to deal with. Or extra mustard seeds. It's a much stronger force. And even on a lower platform, toward any lover of God or someone striving to be a lover of God, it's the greatest obstacle, because as we know, the devotees are most dear to Krishna. And so when we're having malicious or extremely negative mentalities to the individuals themselves, we're going against the nature of bhakti. As we know, this word aparad means to go against Radha or against bhakti, as you all know. And we don't really know anyone else's heart but our own. So we always risk being offensive to someone on a greater level than we may be able to perceive. So what is a Vaishnav? I'd just like to read a little excerpt from an article by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur on Vaishnava Ninda, or criticism of the Vaishnava, where he says, having thus been warned about offending Vaishnavas, it is essential to first ascertain who is a Vaishnava and understand which activities cause Vaishnav aparad. All jivas belong to one of four categories: ordinary jivas, religious jivas, brahmanas, and Vaishnava praya jivas, those who resemble Vaishnavas, and Vaishnava jivas. With the understanding that Sri Krishna resides in all beings, one should show respect to every jiva. Amongst them, some special honor should be shown to religious jivas. It is an essential duty to show honor to the Brahmana jiva and the Vaishnava praya jiva, or those who resemble Vaishnavas. And we are instructed to worship the feet of the Vaishnava jiva. If we neglect to show respect to the ordinary jivas, special honor to the religious jiva, and proper respect to the Brahmana jivas and Vaishnava praya jivas, then we invite sin upon ourselves. But to show disrespect or dishonor to a Vaishnava jiva is an aparad. Performing ordinary penances can erase so many sins, but an aparad is not dispelled so easily. Sins influence the gross and subtle bodies. Aparad specifically affects the jiva's very soul and causes him to fall down. Thus, whoever wishes to perform bhajan of the Lord must guard against committing aparad. This is compulsory. So there are, of course, different opinions on when one really is a Vaishnava. When is one really a Vaishnava? But internally, we don't want to develop unfortunate attitudes toward other Vaishnavas, even if at this point they or we are just resembling Vaishnavas. We know that all jivas should be shown respect. And even those who resemble Vaishnavas, by not showing proper respect, then it can create us more obstacles in the form of sin. But even more so if they are actually Vaishnavas. And of course, we don't know anyone's heart, as I say. So it can affect our progress on a deep level. So it's worth refining this mentality and tendency if we recognize it in ourselves. And if it comes up, nipping it in the bud. It's dangerous, even if we think. I've seen sometimes this kind of mentality can be there, that we think, that person's not a real Vaishnav in the full sense of the term. He's not in bhava or even in ruchi, or he has so many bad qualities. So I can have an attitude towards him all I like. He's not a real Vaishnav. But it's dangerous, because apart from us not being able to fully recognize, it's also cultivating a certain mentality that might end up leading to aparad toward a Vaishnava in the fullest sense in the future, because we don't understand something about them, and it may not fit within our conception of how one should act on that level. So in the Bhagavatam, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he makes this point in the 5th canto, 5.8.26. So this is in the context of Bharat Maharaj. So most of you will be familiar with this pastime of Bharat Maharaj. He became attached to a deer. And so Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes this point that sometimes the prarabdha karma, or the manifest karma, is an arrangement of Krishna's. So he says there are 2 kinds of prarabdha karma, shobhana and ashobhana, beautiful and not beautiful. The first one is like a biting eye ointment administered by the Lord, who is dear to his bhakta, which serves to increase the devotee's eagerness to attain him, and which is freely or independently bestowed by this clever Lord. It appears to be just like ordinary prarabdha. This is even possible to happen to those who've attained rati or bhava bhakti level. The second type of prarabdha is made of one's old karma and is caused by absorption in the sense objects. The former shobhana is mentioned in this verse. So that's quite powerful, right? And the point is that unless we're at least at the stage of nishta ourselves, or ideally higher, but at least at nishta where one is likely a madhyamadhikari and has the scriptural discrimination to see things as they are, unclouded by one's own conditioning, then it can be dangerous to start criticizing and we shouldn't criticizing and demonizing at any level, because the higher Vaishnava will obviously do it out of compassion to help rectify the person. But it's very dangerous at this level, especially, to be criticizing or demonizing someone else's material problems, as we may be even creating a serious problem to our own spiritual lives. So it can be better to err on the side of caution. Now, of course, that doesn't mean, just to make clear, that we turn a blind eye to things that we can see are wrong behaviors. I think that's an important thing that we should understand also. Personally speaking, I've had bad experiences with devotees who are far from the mark, let's say. But we should refine our vision to remember that even if it's even that is something not directly connected to the actual person underneath all that. As Jesus said, hate the sin, not the sinner. It doesn't mean that we need to have faith in someone as being our leader or guru or a high Vaishnava. If we don't have the faith, faith can't be managed, as we know. And it's not a need to have some weird kind of acceptance of problems as being absolutely fine on the relative level and then not dealt with appropriately, especially if it's something that's having a direct impact on others' lives. It should be dealt with, of course. But we should also, Guru Maharaj often makes this point, that we should also be gracious, that we should be gracious with one another. Because it's likely for many of us, we're struggling with many attachments of our own and many problems of our own. And unless we're in a direct position to help such a person, our time and our energy would be better spent on deepening our own practice so that we can help others come beyond their conditioning eventually too. And as I say, I'm not suggesting we become blind to problems where there are problems, or if it's in our particular jurisdiction or our field of activities, and we can take measures to protect those who can be affected, then certainly we should. But my point is more one of refining our inner feeling toward any devotee, even while doing so, even if they're the most degraded and mixed materialistic devotee there is. We definitely don't want to be developing an inimical attitude toward another Vaishnava. To develop a malicious attitude toward anyone or an inimical attitude will never be helpful in our bhajan, especially when we have quite a number of mustard seeds to burn up ourselves. So if we refine that, then all will follow. And actually, there won't, in the grand scheme of things, there won't be any real obstacle. I think the example in the prayers of Devakinandan Das Thakur in his Vaishnav Vandan are really instructive. So for those who aren't familiar, Devakinandan Das Thakur, he was formerly known as Gopal Chapala. So this pastime is described in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, that he offended Srivas Thakur. He put things in front of outside his home, in front of his door, that were usually offered to, believe it was to Durga, to a goddess at least, that liked wine and other nasty things in front of his house. So he put in front of his house, so that all the Vaishnavas and others would believe he was a demigod worshipper. And so later, when Lord Chaitanya came back from Puri after he had taken sannyas, he told Gopal Chapal, take shelter of Srivas Thakur. And so this Gopal Chapal, he became Devakinandan Das Thakur, and he wrote these beautiful prayers. I highly recommend reading all of the prayers, but I'm just going to look at 2 verses today. And so in his prayers, there's this nice mood of offering respect to all devotees that were, all that are, and all that will be. So that includes those who may not be there yet, like maybe ourselves for some of us. But by sincerely continuing to strive in that direction, will one day be so when Krishna desires it. So these verses, this is verses 5 and 6. Jai deshe deshe baise gorangera gana, udva bahu korivandung sabaracharana, hoyachena hoibena prabhura jata das, sabaracharana vandung donti korigas. With upraised arms, I pray to the feet of all of Gauranga's bhaktas, in whichever country they may reside. Holding a straw between my teeth, I submit at the feet of all servants of Mahaprabhu that were or will be. So we want to develop a mentality like this. Now, it might not always be easy, especially when we're faced with the conditioning of others and ourselves, and what to speak of the combination of the two. As we know, it's not always so easy. But I would say our only real obstacle are our own mentalities, which if we can refine in the direction, for example, of the Shikshashtakam, we will overcome no problem in the due course of time. So we may struggle with embodying this 3rd verse, this famous 3rd verse of Shikshashtakam, often said, we're around your neck, this verse, this Trinadapi Sunichena. So this 3rd verse, remember, actually this is correlated, you may be familiar, correlated with someone at Nishta. So we might not be able to fully embrace that verse. We're refining our attitudes and our understandings so we can come to this stage of Nishta, our interim goal. So we may not always truly, on a deep level, be embodying this 3rd verse, although certainly we should strive for it. We should strive for it. And the humility we can take, even if we can't embody the humility there in the 3rd verse, that will be there naturally for someone at Nishta. The humility we can take is shown in the 2nd verse, the Shikshashtakam, that I don't have taste for the holy name, Lord. I don't have taste for the practices of bhakti. I've got these obstacles. So I'm not more tolerant than a tree. I'm not more humble than a blade of grass. I do want respect for myself, and I'm not so prepared to give respect to all others, especially those irritating ones, But please, Krishna, I pray, please help me to help me to come to that stage, and that's the desire we should have. Let's have that desire to go in the direction of that verse. So please nip any negative attitudes in the bud when they come up that I have towards practitioners on this path of bhakti. Just for whatever reason it may be. Whether it's coming from ego, or maybe there is something real there and these kind of things, but to nip them in the bud when they arise in ourselves and help us to learn and grow from even them, even if it's from a distance, and help us to genuinely embrace this 3rd verse so that we can chant always Sada Hari. And this kind of chanting is what will counteract all our karma, even all our aparads, if we don't continue feeding them, of course, and we work to overcome them. Then we'll be able to embrace this 111 and attain the perfection of selfless service to Krishna. So, lots can be said on that. And obviously there are lots of nuances, but I think I'll end there, just looking at the time. And then open up if there's any corrections or insights or questions, of course. And yeah, so please feel free to unmute yourself. And remember also to click on interpretation English or Spanish, maybe for the Spanish speaking devotees.
Haribol.
Haribol.
It's Shamananda here.
Hare Krishna, Shamananda.
Haribol, thank you so much for the class.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And you mentioned that you might bring up next time the term Arop Siddha Bhakti.
Mm.
And to me, like that term seems to more like directly mean dovetailing, whereas what is the yukta vairagya is also dovetailing, but like as it says in the verse, it's dovetailing things that you're not attached to. So if you want to comment on, of course, you may speak on this next time maybe, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, I think you're spot on actually, and maybe I shouldn't have been using the term yukta vairagya in every sense. I guess like you say, the way I've understood Aropa Siddha Bhakti is kind of like I mean obviously there are many aspects to understanding it. One is kind of like the Bhakti version in the school of Uttama Bhakti, that version of Nishkama Karma Yoga, for example. And like you say, it's that we have material attractions and material desires for things, and then we offer them to Krishna, as kind of like, it's still because I want to enjoy them, but so that we can purify them, make them become transcendentalized, so to speak, and make progress in that direction. But also, I believe, or at least as I've heard sometimes, it can even refer to those activities that aren't directly the activities of bhakti. So in terms of the angas of bhakti or the limbs of bhakti, that we'll read there's 64 main angas, for example, that Rupa Goswami brings up, and we'll explore those for sure next time, some of them. But whereas those, because the practices themselves, they're infused, let's say, with Sarup Shakti, then that's why they're so powerful. There's such powerful practices that even someone can do those kind of practices unknowingly in a mixed form and these kind of things and get some kind of benefit and these things. Whereas I guess this is where the shades might be. And I'm as I say, I'm no expert on these things, so maybe I'm misunderstanding the terms. But yukta vairagya could include Aropa Siddha Bhakti, for example, but it could also include the angas of bhakti. So let's say if someone's doing Aropa Siddha Bhakti, or an aspect of that, then it could be that I want to enjoy this ice cream, so I offer it to Krishna. And so I'm offering it to Krishna, and then I'll enjoy the ice cream. But the kind of, the initial thing behind it was, it's something I'm attached to, really. I want to enjoy this kind of thing. But also it could be that, I'm brushing my teeth. Guru Maharaj sometimes gives this example of, I'm brushing my teeth, and brushing your teeth isn't really an anga of bhakti in the fullest sense, but you're because you're seeing your body as a sadhaka deha, that we're sadhakas, we're practitioners of bhakti, and like that you're taking care of Krishna's body and these kind of things. And so then another aspect of yukta vairagya, let's say, can be utilizing the material energy. So let's say in a direct anga of bhakti, kirtan, harmonium in and of itself, as we know, a harmonium isn't made of Sarup Shakti in and of itself. Let's say, it's an instrument that was created, however many years, I think 100, 200 years ago, whatever, even in Europe. But as we know, it's so highly utilized in kirtan around the world. It's so in that sense, there's Yukta Vairagya there. So correct me if I'm wrong, Prabhu, because maybe you've looked into it more. I've not, to be honest. But the way I'd understand is Yukta Vairagya could contain any of those things. But yeah, please, Prabhu, if you'd like to, if that's okay, or if there's anything you'd add to that.
Okay, I'm not like prepared in any way to correct, or this is like what I remember hearing, that Yukta Vairagya is specifically things you're not attached to. I think the word is maybe, I think the word in there is nirbandha, nirbandha Krishna sambandhe, something like this.
Okay, well then thank you for sharing, because yeah, that's helped correct my misunderstanding on it.
Because
sorry, please.
Yeah, because the Aropsida Bhakti is the one that I see, is the one that could include both. Like, for example, growing flowers is not Bhakti, but if you're a Pujari and you're like growing flowers so that you have something to offer, then that becomes Bhakti. But also you could, I think Jiva Goswami in Bhakti Sandarbha quotes the Yat Karoshi verse from Bhagavad Gita when he talks about Aropsida Bhakti, that like whatever you do it for me.
Okay.
Yeah, some thoughts.
Oh, you know, wonderful, thank you. That's it, the power of sadhu sangha, right? That we learn and we grow also. But yeah, so I'll study that for next time. I'll look more in, and so thank you for sharing.
Okay.
For sharing that. Thank
you so much.
Hare Krishna.
I have a comment, but I don't know if I can be heard because I don't have.
Yeah, I can hear whoever that is. I'm not sure.
Okay, it's Mahara. Thank you.
Krishna Mahara.
That was a great class. Thank you. And in regards to criticizing devotees, I was reading in Narahari Sarakara Thakur Sri Krishna Bhajan that even if one is fallen and has engaged in bhakti but is fallen at the time, that the fire of Krishna consciousness is within them, and eventually it will burn up all their material desires. So.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So
thank you for sharing.
To never criticize anyone, because it's not good. And it can always come back on us too.
Yeah, I've sometimes heard Guru Maharaj make this point. Guru Maharaj make this point that obviously on a relative platform, there are you could say some activities that are more heinous than others and these kind of things. But for us as individuals, the biggest obstacle are those obstacles that we're facing ourselves, right? Like, it's not that this obstacle is worse than that person's obstacle, or that person's obstacle is worse than our obstacle, because what's worse is the thing that's blocking us ourselves, right? The thing that's in front of us. So that's probably the better place to focus our energy and our practice.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you.
Thank you, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
And any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you all for joining, and we'll continue next week. And I think it'll be the final one next week also. So, Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindubhya eva cha patitanam bhavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Hare Krishna.
Madan Mohan Prabhu ki jai.
Jai.